by a chant as we deepen our attunement in this moment, God and Gurus. Holding this vibration, the name of the Lord, heart open to receive the blessings in this moment. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this third class in this session, in this series on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And we have only covered the first sutra. I'm sure we will catch up, I hope. So in the first two classes, the first class, we more or less understood where we are coming from, what is the role of this great scripture, what is the role of the scripture on our path, on the path of Kriya Yoga, why is it relevant for the disciples of Paramahamsa Yogananda, for the disciples of this great lineage of gurus. And then in the last class, we went through the first sutra, which is the first sutra introducing yoga, the discipline of yoga, as Patanjali calls the sutra, Atha Yoga Anushasanam. That is now begins the discipline or the practice of yoga, right? And we went on into the definition of, or rather, understanding more what the significance of that word Atha is. The word now, which represents the readiness of a sadhaka, of a practitioner on this path. The word now also represents a sort of a reflection on the transition, right? So whenever we say now, so it's like it brings our awareness, it brings our concentration, it brings our focus into the moment, and as if demarcating this moment from all that has happened before, right? So you in from that context, the word atha, the word now, also implies this kind of a transition from a state of maybe confusion, a state of disillusionment, a state of low energy, a state of confusion where there is lack of clarity, into a state of clarity, into light from that darkness of confusion, right? So when we start on the practice, once obviously there is a sort of in the life of a sadhaka, there is a point where we start the practice, right? But when we look at it as from a continuum perspective, every moment we are on this path, there's an opportunity to transition into this now, right? And that's where every moment, every breath can be that opportunity to start that practice of yoga, right? And which means that whatever we have done, whatever that has happened in the past, how so much we have struggled, this is another moment, a new opportunity to come back into our practice of yoga. And if you look at it, the entire life of a yogi, the entire life of a sadhaka is actually nothing but these moments of clarity, these moments of smriti, right? Remembrance, as it's called. The whole path is about remembering that this is the moment where we can again come back and start our practice and leave the past behind, right? As Sri Yukteswarji used to say, that lives of all men is dark with many shames, right? But the future is going to be bright if we make that effort, the right spiritual effort now, right? And that is again the now that brings us into the moment, ready to practice. And that's why Master used to say, awake and ready, right? Because when we are awake and ready, then in this moment, we can seize the moment, carpe diem, and practice our techniques, our devotion, our jnana, whatever is the path that we are following, right? So from that perspective, now also holds a very prominent significance, and that's why a lot of this in scriptures, when we look at, you see that the word atha is generally used in the beginning of these scriptures because it helps us bring the focus. It is almost like a lot of scriptures you'll see will start with the sacred syllable of Om, right? Because Om is considered auspicious, right? Similarly, Atha is also considered auspicious because it brings us into the moment. It brings us into the now, where we can do the practice, right? In fact, if you look at it, our entire life, there is nothing that happens outside of this now, right? Everything that is happening, that has happened, that will always happen in this now, right? And that is why if you could only seize this moment, if you could only seize this now, we have the opportunity to practice what we have to practice and to go forward on the spiritual path, right? And that is why now is very important. Similarly, when we look at the word yoga, we'll come to the definition of yoga, because now today what we'll do is we'll go into the next three sutras together. We'll try and make sense of the three sutras, because Patanjali is going to be very sort of clear, which he is going to be very much articulate about what are we going to go about, what is our target, what happens when we reach the target, and what happens when we miss the target, right? So in the next three verse, Patanjali is just going to sort of take us in the deep end of this whole yogic paradigm, right? And in the practices as we go forward, in the practices of yoga, right? And that practice comes from the word anusashanam, right? Anusashanam means discipline. It also means, it comes from the word anu and sashanam, right? Anu means to sort of follow, right? Which comes behind, and sashanam means in a sort of in a lineage or in a structure, in a discipline, right? So that's why it's more like following in the footsteps of the great masters, right? And that is why yoga is also a guru shishya sort of a parampara. It's given in a guru shishya parampara, right? Because it's a sacred science which can only be understood by a self-realized yogi, right? A self-realized master. And in fact, when we go later in the sutras, Patanjali also describes how we can get right knowledge, right? And then he gives the three conditions which is required for those knowledge. I'm sure some of us who are going through the sutras will have gone through this sutra also. But the fact is, we need a right authority to give us that knowledge and to help us or guide us on this path, on this journey, right? And that is why the word anushasana is also very important. It not just implies practice, which is also implied by the word abhyasa, which Patanjali is going to use frequently, but it also means following it in the footsteps of a tradition, of a lineage of self-realized masters, right? And behind us, we have the great lineage of the self-realized masters who are all guiding our footsteps on this journey, right? So now this is all about the first sutra. We will keep coming back to every sutra. I am sure there will be enough to talk about each of these sutras. We can never talk or understand the layers in the meaning, because there's so many facets to every sutra that we'll always have to sort of come back and take a particular view to understand what exactly that sutra is sort of trying to sort of portray in front of us, right? Okay, so now going and or rather coming to the second sutra, right? And the second sutra is where Patanjali is now going to describe what is yoga, right? And in the second sutra, Patanjali says yoga chitta vritti nirodha, right? So Patanjali is saying that yoga is the neutralization of the vortices of feeling, right? Let's take word by word, right? Each of these words, right? As we understand, Patanjali is an expert grammarian, so we should not take every word lightly. So we'll try and understand the meaning of every word, right? Now, yoga is yoga. Now, the thing is, yoga also as a word comes from various connotation, right? And if you look back into scriptures, yoga as a word is described or defined in various forms, in various from various perspective, right? Which is suited to the discussion, right? So if you look at it, say in Bhagavad Gita, yoga is described in various forms, right? In fact, all the 18 chapters of Bhagavad Gita begin with the name of a yoga, right? So the first chapter starts with something like the Vishad Yoga, right? The second chapter starts with Sankhya Yoga, right? So on and so forth. So all the 18 chapters start with a kind of a yoga, right? So in a way, when we look at it from that perspective, yoga means a science, right? It means a way to reach a particular goal. And obviously, the goal is what we are going to understand by the word yoga, right? So yoga not just explains the state or the outcome of that thing that we are trying to achieve, which is the state of yoga. Yoga also describes the path or the process or the mechanics or the technique to reach to that end state, right? In fact, this was the view we took from the when we were looking at the first sutra, that between the knowledge or the philosophy or the darshan of Sankhya and Vedanta, yoga serves as the root, as the path, right? But yoga also, in the definition which we are going to look at, or which we are already looking at, Patanjali is describing yoga as a state, right? Patanjali is going to describe it as a state, in fact, as a state and as a process to reach that state also, right? So in the same verse or in the same sutra, Patanjali is going to take both of that perspective, right? So as we are talking about in Bhagavad Gita, there are various perspectives from which yoga is described, right? There's a very popular verse of yoga which is generally used by karma yogis, right? And in this verse, Sri Krishna says, yoga karmashu kausalam. Kausalam means skillfulness or perfection, right? So Krishna is saying yoga is also perfection of karma, of work, right? So when we do sort of a skillful work, it is a way of yoga, right? Or yoga helps us do skillful work, because when we are in a state of yoga, every work, every act that we do comes from that state of divinity, or comes from the state of centeredness, collectedness, from the state of union with God, right? And that is why whatever we do is effortless. Whatever we do is sort of illumined by clarity, right? And that is what Sri Krishna tries to explain when he's trying to say that yoga is skillfulness in work, right? Similarly, if we look at it in different Upanishads or Vedas, yogas are defined in different means. In fact, in Yoga Vashishta, yoga is defined as the control or a way to calm the mind, right? Which is very close to the definition we are going to take or look at, right? Yoga is also described in Bhagavad Gita as a state of equanimity, right? In a state of equanimity of ourself, of our energy, of our wisdom, right? And Sri Krishna also uses a word which is called sthit pragya, right? Which means the stabilization of the pragya, which means the wisdom. So when the mind is stabilized, when we are stabilized in our wisdom, when we are stabilized in our action, in our energy, then we are in a state of yoga, right? So all of these are definitions, or these are descriptors about yoga, right? But Patanjali, because this is Yoga Shastra, right? This is the core scripture of yoga. Patanjali is going to give a sort of an authoritative definition of what is that state of yoga and how to reach that state of yoga. And from that perspective, if you look at it, Patanjali is from that perspective very articulate, very clear, very particular, right? In fact, some of us, when we work in corporate, and we have to do this exercise called goal setting, right? So it's like when we have to define our goals, we usually use a sort of a mnemonics or an acronym which is called SMART, right? So SMART. And this is generally to remind us that whatever goals we are setting or whatever we are describing has to sort of reflect these qualities, right? And what are these qualities? These qualities are, S refers to specific, that our goal, our target should be very specific. It should be measurable, M for measurable, A for it should be attainable or actionable, that it shouldn't be very theoretical, it shouldn't be just philosophy that we cannot sort of do something about it, right? So it has to be actionable, and that's why we need something which is tangible, which is what we can follow, right? So that is actionable or attainable, right? R, which is sort of relevant, right? Which means that it has to be relevant to the objective or the agenda or the aim of the exercise. And and yoga, as we understand from our discussion of the first sutra, yoga gives us the promise of that everlasting consciousness, ever existing existence, and everlasting bliss, ever new bliss, right? From that perspective, it is most relevant of whatever we do in our lives, right? So it is going to be, it has to be relevant when we are taking up a goal or setting a plan, right? And then it has to be time bound, right? So there should be a way to conclude that. There should be, we could define that in a time boundedness, right? And if you look at it, Patanjali's definition is going to, in a way, follow all of these, or in fact more, right? So when we look at it, the definition of yoga as given by Patanjali is yoga chitta vritti nirodha, right? So in this context, the word yoga, the way Patanjali is going to use that word, is it's with respect to a state of our consciousness, right? And that's where a state of our chitta, or the state of our spiritual heart, or our feeling, right? That is the sort of the metric, or the sort of the lens through which we are going to evaluate whether we have achieved the state of yoga or not, right? So this feeling of the heart is that metric, right? Is that benchmark? And then what Patanjali is saying, it's a neutralization of all of the vortices of that feeling. All the vrittis in our chitta, when it is neutralized, it means we are in a state of yoga, right? And hence it's a very specific definition. It's a definition we can act upon. It is a definition by which we can reflect whether we are in a state of yoga or not, or how much we are in a state of yoga. If our consciousness, if our chitta is completely restless, it is completely agitated, it is, say, if it is turmoiled, right? Then it is completely out of tune. We are completely out of synchronization of the state of yoga, right? But when as our mind, our heart, our energy is going calmer and calmer and calmer, we are going closer and closer and closer to the definition or to the state of yoga, right? And hence it gives us a barometer, right? It gives us a way to measure how much we are in a state of yoga, right? Now let us unpack each of these words further, right? So first we understood that yoga in this case is referred to the state of our consciousness, the state of our heart, the state of the chitta, right? In fact, Vyasa, who is one of the foremost commentator on the Yoga Sutras, Vyasa is the Ved Vyasa. Obviously, he is the compiler of all of the great scriptures. So the way he has attributed this word yoga, he says yoga has samadhi, right? So he says the meaning of yoga here is equivalent to samadhi, right? So it's samadhi, which is again, yoga and samadhi are equivalent, is what he's trying to say. And samadhi, as we would understood, also means the neutralization of the state of our awareness, right? Pavanji, we're just going through the sutras. Right now, we're not on a specific page, right? If there are a specific references, I'll point it out, right? So we're just going through the definitions and into the descriptions, right? So as we were talking about, so first part is the yoga, right? So here yoga refers to the state of neutralization. Then comes the word chitta, right? Now what is chitta? Chitta refers to, as Swamiji talks about, chitta refers to the feeling, right? Feeling of the heart, right? And as we discussed in prior classes, when we talk about heart, we're not talking obviously about the physical heart, we are talking about that innermost core of our being, right? Where all of our deepest desires, attachments, aversions, likes, dislikes reside, right? Which is in the Anandamaya kosha of the body, right? So in a way, we that chitta is a heart where all our feelings reside, the deepest, most cherished, most core feelings which describe our existence, our personality, our outlook on life. All of that is what is being referred to as chitta, right? So it is the heart, it is the feelings of the heart. Vritti now is a very, again, a very particular, very specific word which Patanjali uses. Now, vritti comes from, vritti literally means something which is revolving, right? We also know the word vrit, right? Those of us who have studied some geometry in Hindi, we know vrit means a circle, right? So it's a circular or a revolutionary or a revolution around a center, which is called vritti, right? And that is why the word vritti here sort of reminds us of this whirlpool or this eddy-like motion of the energy in our heart or in the astral spine, right? Now we again come back to take a look at this word again in context of all of the rest of the words, but it's good to know vritti here is meaning something which is revolving, right? Like a vortex or a whirlpool or an eddy, right? So that is vritti, right? And then the word nirodha, which means control, right? Which means restraint, which means neutralization, right? So again, nirodh is a very specific word because it gives us the way we can achieve it, right? So it's Patanjali not saying that it will just evaporate, it will just disappear, it will just dissolve of its own. Patanjali is saying we have to nirodh it, right? Which means we have to literally control that vrittis in our heart, right? And hence the whole practice of yoga is going to be something which is going to take effort, which is going to take energy, which is going to take determination, and hence the path of yoga is a path of also a path of action, right? So now let's again come back to the definition. So we are saying yoga is chitta vritti nirodha, right? Hence, it means that it's a way, or a yoga is a way, as well as it's the state which is achieved when we have neutralized all of these vortices or the feelings in our heart, right? Now, how to do that is what Patanjali is going to take us into when we go into the further sutras, right? But what Patanjali is doing right now is to sort of define what is the meaning of yoga, right? Now, this is the second verse, right? Now, in the third verse, now Patanjali says, okay, what happens once we have neutralized these vortices, once we have calm these feelings, these restless energies in the heart, right? What happens then? And then Patanjali says, Tada drashtu swarupen avasthanam, right? Tada means then, drashtu means the seer or the sage, as Swamiji describes it. Swarupen means the self identity or the form or the self swarup. Swarup means self view or self form of self identity, right? Swarup avasthana means abiding or being stabilized or resting, right? So what Patanjali is saying that once we have neutralized those feelings in our heart, then the sage or the seer rests in its own self, in its true form, in its own swarupa, right? And also we'll come back to what is the meaning or what is the implication of swarup, right? Then, so this is the third verse where Patanjali is describing what happens once we have achieved that neutralization of the vortices, of the vrittis in our heart, right? Then what Patanjali says is that in the next verse, Patanjali then says, but what happens when it does not happen? Or most of the time, when we are not in a state of yoga, then what happens, right? So in a way, Patanjali is now, it's like, as we say, it's giving a definition or an explanation which is mutually exclusive and cumulatively exhaustive, as we like to call it, right? Misi. So what now Patanjali is saying is that when we are not in a state of yoga, then what happens? And the way sutra goes is vritti sarupyam itiratra, right? Which means that vritti sarupyam itiratra. Itiratra means then or when it is not in the state of yoga, thereafter or everywhere else, right? So in everywhere else, when we are not in the state of union or in the state of samadhi or yoga, then we identify our swarupa becomes those vrittis themselves, right? A very powerful, very clear sort of reflection on what is actually happening with us moment by moment, right? So what actually is happening, and when you look at this verse, it's a very, and that's why every word which Patanjali uses and the word which Patanjali does not use also gives us a very deep implication of what he's trying to say. So when Patanjali is saying vritti sarupyam itiratra, Patanjali never talks in this verse. Patanjali has not even touched upon the drashtu which he was talking about in the earlier verse. So when he was saying tada drashtu swarupen avasthanam, then he was talking about the seer. But then he says when we are not in the state of yoga, then the seer disappears. Then there is no seer. Why? Because our sarupya, our uh, our identity gets conjoined with that vritti itself, which means that we become that vritti. We identify so strongly with that vritti that we can't really find our true identity, right? And this is so profound and this is so clear of what really happens moment by moment, right? When we are lost in a thought, right? Suddenly we become anxious, right? Say suppose there is a very important meeting coming up tomorrow, right? We have to prepare for the meeting. We are remembering what happened in the last meeting, right? We remember what were the comments, and suddenly our mind gets lost in that vritti that we forget who and where we are, and our mind, our identity gets completely immersed in that vritti, and then we become one with that vritti, right? And this is the power of Maya that we were talking about the other day, right? So what Maya is doing, as this thought sort of comes over us from the takes comes over us from the behind our mind sort of becomes sort of immersed, engulfed into this vritti, right, which is a whirlpool which has its center a thought, right, or a desire or a aversion, say in this case, right? We want to avert that sort of embarrassing situation, for example, right? So when that vritti starts to form, it starts to gather energy towards its center, right? There is an I at that center of the vritti, which is the I, the ego, and that as it gathers a specific energy momentum, it sort of sucks our attention, it sucks our awareness, and it sucks our identity into it. And then we suddenly become overpowered, we become immersed, we become anxious, right? And it sort of takes us into that rabbit hole of emotion and all that, right? And that is what is happening when we are not in the state of yoga, right? So if you look at it in these three verses, Patanjali is describing what is yoga, right? What happens once we have achieved yoga, and then if we haven't achieved, what happens in that state, right? And for most of us, most of the time, we are in the state of vritti sarupyam, right? Which means we are in the state of immersion, we are in the state of disillusionment, we are in the state where we have completely given our identity to that thought itself, right? Now when we just think about these teachings, it seems that okay, kabhi kabhi hota hai, hamesha nahi hota, right? We feel that at times it happens, but not always. Most of the time, I'm well aware, right? I'm clear. I'm a yogi, right? Most of the time, that is our experience, or at least our identity, right? But if we watch closely, every moment we are really giving our identity to some thought, right? And obviously, it's easy to reflect on that in moments where we have completely lost our identity, right? For example, say suppose we get ill, right? And suddenly, first day we sort of we go through it. It seems okay, we are strong and healthy, so it does not matter a lot. The next day, say suppose the illness continues, we become slightly weak, our energy slightly goes down, and so is our confidence in our body, right? And say suppose the illness continues for a couple of more days or a few more days, suddenly the we become so engrossed with that state of illness that suddenly we give it our complete identity, right? And if somebody asks us in those moments, kya hua, what happened, then what we'll say? We'll say, मैं बीमार हूँ, right? Which means मैं बीमार, we have conjoined it, right? We say, I am ill, right? So I have conjoined my identity with that state of the body, right? Similarly, when say suppose we are very anxious, we were just discussing the example of that meeting, right? A very important meeting. All meetings are important, and then suddenly we become so anxious that and we become so restless that if somebody and somebody checks us out, we would say, I'm tense, right? Which means I am tensed. It's not that my mind is tense. It's not that I am feeling the tension in the mind. It's that we become that tension itself, right? And that is what Patanjali means when Patanjali is saying vritti sarupyam itiratra, right? Which means elsewhere, everywhere, when we have not restrained those feelings of the heart, those vortices are sort of overpowered by those fluctuations or eddies of of desires, of aversions, we become sort of identified with those vrittis, right? So, by looking at it, Patanjali helps us understand that what is yoga really trying to do, right? And what yoga is really trying to do is help us get power to control these vrittis and control our self-identification, right? Now, it's useful to understand how that happens, right? If we go through the discussion of the verse when through the book, when we are talking about when we're talking about the whole definition of yoga, right? Yoga chitta vritti nirodha, right? Then Swamiji takes us into how Kriya Yoga helps us sort of neutralize all those vortices, all those vrittis in our heart, right? So we all, most of us are Kriyavan here. We understand how Kriya, or at least we know about the way Kriya works, right? So what happens, first of all, it's good to understand how are these vrittis formed in the first place, right? So what happens is that whenever there's a perception of an object, right? Object, I mean, there's a very nice way to look at what is an object, right? Object is something which, in a way, objects to our consciousness, right? So if, say, suppose we are looking at an object, say, suppose I'm looking at my hand, right? Now my eyes is able to look at this hand because this hand is obstructing the light, which is otherwise sort of scattering through the entire space. And when it is scattered back, because it is blocking that sort of the motion of those light rays, I'm able to see this hand, right? So in a way, consciousness, whenever there's an object which obstructs to the otherwise expansiveness of the consciousness in a way sort of object is reflected into that consciousness. So what is happening is that as the senses gather all this information inside a mind, the mind first organizes, and we discuss the four parts of the antakarana, the finer instruments of perception, which is the chitta, buddhi, ahankar, and manas, right? So manas is the grossest of these four elements. So what manas is doing is manas sort of organizes all the sense informations, right? So it sort of bases our likes, dislikes, temperament, mood, state of mind. It sort of, in a way, sort of consolidates what the raw impression our senses are bringing. Once we have this raw consolidated data, then that data is presented to ahankar, right? Which is the identifying principle or the ego principle. And then that ahankar looks at it from the center, from its own sort of center of what we are really looking at, right? Or what it means that we are looking at, right? And then it is presented to buddhi, which then makes sense of that object or discerns that object, right? So buddhi, in a way, is the most subtlest or the finest of that perception, the instruments of perception, right? And chitta is obviously the, in a way, the it's closest to the purusha. In a way, Chitta comes directly from the Chit aspect of the Purusha, right? Which is the seer, which is the Drashtu, which Patanjali is talking about. So in a way, what is happening whenever a object is presented into the consciousness takes a form of that object. The manas, the buddhi, take a grasp of that object and take a form. It's almost there's an impression of that object in our mind, in our consciousness, right? Now, if we give attention to that object in terms of whether I like it or not like it, whether I want it or not want it, what happens with this flow of energy of likes and dislikes, they sort of get a special power. And in a way, they create a vortex. Why vortex? Because with that likes and dislikes, what we are really telling us, sort of the self-organizing principle within our chitta, that this is what I want, right? Or this is what I don't want. So what it does is it gathers an energy around that thought, right? And that thought in a form of a causal thought, then it sort of goes and resides, and if we have given it enough energy, it builds a larger momentum, a larger sort of whirlpool of energy around it, right? And it becomes more and more strong. And as we give it more energy, so it sort of starts to become more and more in a way solidified, right, in our awareness. So whenever it would come, we would definitely notice it, right? So say suppose we have, say I have an say a like sort of a likeness for chocolate ice cream, say for example, right? Now if I have that likeness that has developed because, say suppose the first time I had, I liked it, right? Which means there was a pleasure, right? And then as the Purusha, which was observing it, it sort of, when it gave that attention, that power to that chitta, and it gave power to the mind, what it did, it sort of stored that memory in its sort of in its memory, in its subtle body, as something which is pleasurable, right? And it creates a small vritti around it the first time I did it, right? The next time, whenever that object comes, that vritti pops up that thought from the subconscious into the conscious, that hey, this is the same thing which we liked, let's have it again, right? And then we again put energy into that thought because we accept that thought. The Purusha then gives power to that thought by accepting that thought. And once that thought is accepted, we again have it. And it again creates a sensation which is pleasurable. And again, it creates that cycle of sort of giving more energy into that vritti, and hence that vritti starts to sort of oscillate, rotate, revolve with even more energy. And the every time we give into that desire, we give into that attraction, it becomes stronger and stronger until it becomes a very strong vritti. In fact, it becomes our character, right? As we become habitual in doing that, right? And this is how uh, lifetimes after lifetimes we have been gathering these vrittis, which then get stored in the astral spine, right? And as we understand, astral spine is sort of directionally from the lower chakras to higher chakras. It represents a subtlety or a higher state of vibration as we go from lower chakras to the higher chakras, right? So depending on what is the state of consciousness from which this vritti was created, it could either be stored into lower chakras. If it is very gross desire, that will be stored lower towards lower chakras. If it is a higher desire, if it's a desire like trying to sort of love for God or kindness or sympathy, right? Those kinds of desires would sit higher up on the chakras. Nevertheless, every desire will be stored in form of a vritti in the astral spine, right? And every time the conditions are right, when the object presents itself, or whenever there is a trigger to that vritti, it suddenly pops up, it creates a thought, it creates a trigger, it creates an entire cycle of that feedback loop, which forces us to act on that desire, on that craving, right? And that is where yoga is coming and trying to control the proliferation of these desires by acting on these desires, right? And the way Kriya Yoga helps, as we all know, that Kriya Yoga, when we are doing that practice, we are in a way gathering, or we are trying to pull the energy out of those small or large vrittis and bring that in the central astral spine, so that the vrittis, the energy, it's like the cell which was powering that vritti, we have removed that cell itself. And that as the cell goes off, the vritti also dies, right? Because the energy which was powering that vritti sort of is then liberated or extracted, or sort of taken out from that center, right? And once we take that energy out, however, the seed thought is still there, and hence the next part of the practice is then those all those seed desires, seed of karmas are then burned into the light of consciousness, right? And the light, the divine light of consciousness, or the illumination of awareness, right? So what happens, we in a way we first remove all that energy which makes the vrittis go small, or in a way they lose some power, and bit by bit we remove a lot of that energy if those are stronger vrittis, right? And once those vrittis are strong, once the vrittis are weakened enough that they are just in seed form, in the causal form, then those vrittis we can actually take and burn them at the spiritual eye through the practices, right? Which means that once we have really reflected on the futility of those desires, on the, as Master used to say, that once we have tasted the divine nectar, the taste of that stale cheese no longer impresses us, right? So, Master, as he says to Swamiji, that when ecstasy comes, all the lower desires go, right? And that is what is happening, that the lower desires, those vrittis which are now in a causal form, are then burned in that ecstasy of union with God, or in the union of yoga, right? And that is how Kriya Yoga helps us remove or make all of those vrittis sort of impotent, right? Or dissolves or neutralizes those vrittis. And hence, it, in a way, in sort of with all the Kriya that we are doing, it's in a way helping us expand our identity, right? The identity which gets sort of limited to the body, to our personality, to our self definitions, bit by bit, we sort of start to expand that identity. And as that identity expands to universe, that I, that right now we are identifying with as a point in our heart, or at the medulla, or a point between our eyes, that point sort of merges with the infinite. It merges with every atom of creation. And that is the state of Sabikalpa Samadhi, right? So in Sabikalpa Samadhi, what is going to happen, as Patanjali will describe later, is that that identity we have, that I, which is situated at the center of every vortex, every vritti, that I want this, I like this, I am this, I don't like that, right? The I, which is at the center, that suddenly expands so much that it reaches to the farthest boundaries of universe, and we become identified not with one center, but with every center. And that's why Master describes God as as center nowhere, circumference everywhere, right? Which means that or rather circumference nowhere, center everywhere, right? Which means there's no one single place, one single point from where we are experiencing life, right? Life in a way starts to happen with every bit of creation, right? And our identity sort of, it's almost like somebody smears our identity through the far reaches, expanses of the infinite universe, right? And that is Savikalpa Samadhi. And then in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, what is going to happen is that the identity which we had, that identity itself vanishes. And then we realize that God is me, right? So it's like the first stage where we realize Aham Saha, so that I becomes infinite. In the second phase, the infinite becomes the I, right? So we realize the God itself, the every atom of creation which is endowed with the Satchidananda principle of God, is I, is nothing but I amness, right? And that is the state where a sage or a yogi resides or abides once he or she has achieved the state of yoga or nirvikalpa samadhi. right? So this is a very succinct sort of representation of all that. Obviously, there are a lot more examples, stories, comments in the chapter, right? And I would certainly invite you, encourage you to go through those as Swamiji has brought out these points. But it's also good to understand how, and in the current state, our identification is limited, right? And how through the process, through the practices of Kriya Yoga, through the practices of Hong So, through the practices of devotion, bit by bit, we are expanding that identity and we are releasing all those vortices which sort of bind us, which restrict us, and which limit our identity to this body, right? Uh, so I think we will cover only this much in this class. We will move forward in the next class where we'll now understand what these vrittis are. So there, Patanjali will go on and describe the different kinds of vrittis, and he'll say Patanjali describes the vrittis in 5 classifications and 2 categories, right? So he talks about the different 5 categories of vrittis and the nature of their being their painful or painless or not painful, right? And then he describes each of those vrittis, and then we go into the practices of abhyasa and vairagya by which we can control these vrittis, which is going to be the whole manual, right? And so this is going to be the whole path of yoga, right? uh, is there any question before we conclude today's class? If there's a question, feel free to add it in the chat box. I'll try and pick it up if there's a shorter answer. Otherwise, we will discuss in the next class. Meanwhile, let us take a moment to center our awareness, to open our hearts in gratitude to Master Swamiji, to this great lineage, to make us available to these subtle teachings, these techniques, these practices which promise us the ever conscious, ever existing, ever new joy. Oh, thank you, everyone. I hope I'll see some of you in the next session, and joy to you all. Bye.